In this problem, we'll look at series of two events. We are told that we are selecting now, rather than one child, two children in a row without replacement. And we are asked to find some probabilities. Part 1 asks, what's the probability that both children do chores? Now, since we have two events, we have to calculate two separate probabilities. Let's first calculate the probability that the first child does chores. Now, to calculate this, we look to the category totals. Now, we look underneath chores first. There are 662 children who do chores out of a total of 950. Now, we take the 662 and divide by the 950. We'll enter this into Excel now. We click on the 662 and the 950, and we get a probability of 0.696842. Once again, we can reduce the decimal places by going to the decrease decimal button under the Home menu. Now, when we look at the second event, notice that this is without replacement. So, without replacement means this. When we look to the second event, we're going to take one away from the chores total. Effectively, this means we've selected a child and removed them from the collection. We're also going to take one away from the overall total. This means rather than using 662 and 950, instead we'll be using 661 and 949. We're simply taking one away from both the chores category and the total category. We can say the probability that the second child does chores. So we'll type 661 divided by 949. We can see this is very close, but not quite the same as the probability of the first child doing chores. This is because we took one child out of the collection. Now, to find the final probability, we are going to take the first answer times the second answer. That is, we're going to take the probability of the first child doing chores times the probability of the second child doing chores. We'll let Excel handle the math for us here and say equals the first box multiplied by the second box. This gives us a probability of both children doing chores as 0.485366, and we can reduce decimal a few times as well. So you can see that the probability of two children in a row doing chores is significantly less than one child doing chores. It's a difference of about 21 percentage points. We'll have to deal with two events. The first event is that the first child gets an allowance. And we'll look at a second child getting allowance. So let's look at the category total for allowance. We can see that there are 532 children who do get allowance, out of a total of 950. So our first probability will be 532 divided by 950. Now for the second event, both of these categories are going to go down by 1, because we're going to take one away from the children who get allowance, giving us 531, and we're going to remove a child from the collection as well, giving us 949. Let's enter these fractions into Excel. First, 532 divided by 950, and next we'll do 531 divided by 949. Again, the probabilities are very close together, but not quite the same. To get the final answer, we multiply. We'll take C11, multiply by C12. And we get the probability that both children in a row get allowance. So now let's move to part 3. We are asked the probability that the first child receives an allowance and does not do chores. Let's find this first. Let's look under allowance and not doing chores. That will be located underneath the no chores column and the allowance row, giving us 142. Let's record this below. Now we calculate the probability of having an allowance and no chores. Now remember, to find the probability, we take our 142 that we read off the table and divide by the overall total. So we'll divide by 950. This will give us a probability of 0.149474. Again, we can reduce the decimals by clicking decrease decimal. Now the second event they asked us about is that the second child does chores but doesn't receive an allowance. Let's locate that in the table as well. We'll look under the chores column because we want the child to do chores and we don't want them to receive an allowance. This gives us 272 in the yellow box. Let's record that below as well. Now let's calculate the probability. So to calculate this probability, we'll take the 272, but this time, remember, we've already removed one child from the rotation. So our overall total is now no longer 950, it is now 949. Notice we did not subtract 1 from the 272. And the reason why we didn't subtract anything from the 272 is that the first event is a different category than the second event. Therefore, we don't subtract 1. So to calculate the probability, we'll say equals the 272. We'll divide by 949. So now we have the probability of the first event is 0.149, and the probability of the second event is 0.286617. Again, we'll reduce the decimals. And so these two numbers that I'm going to paint green are the numbers we're going to multiply together. We're not going to multiply the number of children, the 142 or the 272. That won't help us get the answer. So now we can say the probability of both events is going to equal the first probability multiplied by the second probability. So the probability of selecting two children in a row, one of them who does allowance and no chores, and the second who does chores but gets no allowance, is 0.042842, a very small probability. Again, we can reduce the decimal. We'll say it's a little bit greater than 4%. So once again, just like before, we are just going to multiply the first probability times the second probability. That's what's going to give us our final answer.